Well, welcome everybody to the Friends of the Library, Friends of the Hannon Library Speaker Series. And I want to thank our board for making this possible, and also the library staff, especially Dr. Carrie Forbes and our Vice President, Ed Bastila. Whenever we gather here, this is kind of a celebration of our literary and intellectual traditions here at the Hannon Library. And we're especially fortunate tonight to have a speaker who's going to talk about Shakespeare, because we are especially proud of our Bailey collection, a world-class collection of Shakespearean materials. So what I want to say is that another tradition that we have is that we acknowledge the presence of the Native American community who lived here long before we got here. And one of the rituals we do is read a prepared statement acknowledging their presence, both historically and in the past. So here goes. The Friends of the Hannon Library take this moment to acknowledge that Southern Oregon University is located within the traditional ancestral homelands of the Shasta, Tacoma, and Lagawa peoples who lived here since time immemorial. These tribes were displaced during the rapid Euro-American colonization, the gold rush, and armed conflict between 1851 and 1856. In the 1850s, the discovery of gold and settlement brought thousands of Euro-Americans to their lands, leading to warfare, epidemics, starvation, and villages being burned. In 1853, the first of several treaties were signed confederating these tribes and others together, who would then be referred to as the Rogue River Tribe. These treaties ceded most of their homelands to the United States, and in return, they were guaranteed a permanent homeland reserved for them. At the end of the Rogue River Wars in 1856, these tribes and many other tribes from Western Oregon were removed to the Siletz Reservation and the Grand Ronde Reservation up north. Today, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians are living descendants of the Tacoma, Shasta, and Lagamas people of this area. The Friends of the Hannon Library encourage you to learn about the land you reside in and join us in advocating an inherent sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. End of statement. Well, tonight we have a presentation by Carolyn Wiesenthal, is a visiting research associate at the new Swan Shakespeare Center at the University of California, Irvine, a 2023 recipient of the Huntington-Oxford Exchange Fellowship, and holds a Ph.D. from the Shakespeare Institute of Birmingham. Until recent years, he had a home in Stratford-upon-Avon, Shakespeare's hometown. And I almost wish I could say the same. Best I ever did is I hitchhiked from London and spent the night in the park at Stratford-upon-Avon because the youth hostel was closed. And Carolyn got to live there. In addition to her studies in Shakespeare, she has rabbinic training that includes studies at the Academy of Jewish Religion in Los Angeles and the Conservative Yeshiva in Jerusalem. This presentation, Reading Shakespeare in the Jewish Theological Tradition, draws on Jewish theology to mount a new reading, away from the traditional ones, of a 400-year-old play, The Merchant of Venice, a reading that sees beyond the anti-Semitism and beyond the Shakespearean themes and into the Shakespearean themes of human potential and human flourishing as studied in the Jewish tradition. So with that in mind, please welcome Carolyn Lyon.
Thank you. Thank you. Uh-oh. Yeah, there's my book, okay? And as you can see, there's some really nice endorsements as well that I'm very proud of. Reverend Dr. Paul Edmondson, Bernie, Susanna Heschel, Julia Lupton, Rabbi David Rosen, and Professor Sir Stanley Wells. So I'm honored that they liked my book. My book offers a fresh look at The Merchant of Venice and has the potential to have some impact by pointing to Shakespearean themes. Okay, by pointing to Shakespearean themes of transformation, caring, and human flourishing, themes that overturn the negative values of the 16th century British colonial enterprise. I see Shakespeare criticism as action. Within the text of The Merchant of Venice, we can point to racist, anti-Semitic, homophobic, materialistic, violent, and selfish characters, and in our expansive world as well, and also illuminate ways that these same characters can move beyond their own toxic behavior toward moral agency. This movement of characters can happen within the dramatic landscape, but also in the aesthetic space beyond the play itself, a sort of parallel universe to our own. We see the play is finished when the figurative curtain drops and the audience stands up and goes home. Sometimes, however, when characters have astounding agency, that agency breaks through the barrier of the stage and influences us in ways in which we have not previously dreamed. The arts and the humanities at their best train us to glean deep, eternal messages, and with these messages, make our world a better place. Therefore, when the Shakespeare Institute in the United Kingdom accepted my Ph.D. proposal to create a theologically Jewish Shakespeare criticism, but asked me to focus on The Merchant of Venice, I knew I had a challenge. The play's characters notoriously writhe with corruption. Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice is controversial, and depending on any one performance, theatergoers are quick to make judgments influenced by directorial decisions. Some directors cut whole acts, others add scenes. The Globe in England recently created a final scene in which Shylock sobs as the waters of baptism are sprinkled on his head. With the text of The Merchant of Venice continually swinging in various directions, it is difficult for the audience to know the play or catch it, so to speak. All interpretation seems to point to Shylock as hero or Shylock as villain. Ultimately, as I explain in the introduction of my book, this worldly drama of either the Jewish villain or a Jewish hero is inhabited by a possibility of transcendence that the play keeps nudging us toward. We can glean from the play the Shakespearean message of transformation that resonates so beautifully with Jewish theology. In this talk, first, I will review my introduction, describe some of the critical and performative history of The Merchant of Venice and the Jewish theological thought tapped in my analysis. Then I will examine characters as explored in the chapters that follow. So, what is The Merchant of Venice? It's a play written by William Shakespeare in 1596. We pinpoint 1596 for several reasons, one of which is the sad history of Rodrigo Lopez, who possibly influenced Shakespeare's character of Shylock. Lopez was a Jewish converso from Portugal and preferred 16th century England and its centuries-old expulsion to the then present or terribly recent Spanish Inquisition. Lopez rose to the envious position of Queen's physician, then was accused of poisoning her. For this, he was executed. According to the records, there was nothing in the judgment or in the descriptions of Lopez written at the time that even mentioned his Jewishness. The fact that Jews had to hide their Jewishness points to anti-Semitism in early modern England. The execution of Lopez, however, arguably does not. While the anti-Semitism of early modern England has been thoroughly documented, a far greater influence of Judaism, in my analysis on Shakespeare, was a fascination with the Jews and a desire to disprove the hateful myths in circulation. Shakespeare was attempting to defend the Jew beyond the caricature of Barabbas in The Jew of Malta, the 1589 play by Christopher Marlowe, and possibly see his play also performed 160 times. What happened, though, was that The Merchant of Venice was performed twice. as we know it, and then discarded for a whole century. There was also the Bassano family. The Bassanos were Jewish musicians for the court of Elizabeth, also conversers of whom the daughter, later known as Amelia Lanier, or the Dark Lady, possibly has some influence on Shakespeare's poetry and plays. We need a quick synopsis of The Merchant of Venice. We first meet Antonio, the merchant, who is sad or world-weary. The dramatic question is established. Will Antonio become satisfied, and if so, how? Soon, Bassanio, his beloved, enters requesting a loan so that he, Bassanio, can woo a wealthy inheritress, Portia. Antonio dives into the opportunity to be at least financially powerful in his beloved's romance. The problem is that Antonio's income stream is dry. His ships are out at sea. So they decide to borrow 3,000 ducats from the Jew Shylock. Shylock rightfully complains about Antonio's disgusting behavior toward him, agrees to the loan, does not charge the usual interest, but as a merry sport, wants a pound of flesh if Antonio should fail on his bond. Meanwhile, cut to Belmont, where we meet Portia. Through a game of caskets, Portia will choose her future husband from the many suitors who approach her, such as Morocco and Aragon. Finally, Bassanio wins. He chooses the right casket. He receives both her love and the symbolic ring that he should never, ever remove. However, back in Venice, Jessica, Shylock's daughter, has skipped down with some of her father's money and the Christian Lorenzo. They arrive at Belmont, and then everyone learns that Antonio's ships have failed. Antonio, bankrupt, is now subject to the bond in which he must sacrifice his pound of flesh. Shylock, furious and heartbroken by the loss of his daughter, takes Antonio to court for the forfeiture. Act 4 takes place in the Venetian court, where Portia disguises herself as a lawyer and wins the case for Antonio. Shylock is there with a knife, ready to receive his pound of flesh, which of course would mean killing Antonio in so doing. Portia points out that while the bond is signed and sealed, the statutes of Venice forbid an alien, such as the Jew, to spill one drop of Christian blood. Shylock, humiliated, loses his estate to Lorenzo and Jessica, while Antonio demands that Shylock be converted to Christianity. Portia is victorious, but upset, because as a thank you, Bassanio offers to her, when she is in the mask of the lawyer, the gift of her ring that he promised never to remove. Back in Belmont, Lorenzo, watching over Portia's estate, delivers a beautiful speech on love and God to Jessica, who then remains silent for the rest of the play. Portia and Bassanio return and settle their dispute concerning the rings, and they all look forward to satisfaction in the morning. Okay. The first quarto of the play was published in 1600, and the first performance was in the court of King James in 1605. Even though what we see here is the first quarto, which says that this was published after many performances had already happened. So we can trust that, or we can trust what we actually know about the 1605 performance. In 1701, Sir George Granville wrote an adaptation of it called The Jew of Venice. A comic actor, Thomas Doggett, played the role of Shylock, and his success at the role possibly points to why a comedic Shylock has been borrowed to this day. In 1741, Charles Macklin played the comedic stereotypical villain. There he is. In 1814, the nasty Shylock of Macklin was replaced by the sympathetic Shylock of Edmund Kean. We have also, can you guys hear me? I don't know. Okay, good. Yeah. We also have Richard Burbage here, who most probably played Shylock in 1605. Okay, though it can be argued that before 1605, it actually was performed. That would have been William Kemp, the comedian. Okay, let's see. And here is Edmund Kean, who did a much more sympathetic Shylock. And that was in 1814. Finally, in 1879, Henry Irvine played the hero Shylock, noble and exotic. After Irving's famous performance with Ellen Terry's Portia, there was a dive back into anti-Semitic performances, such as that directed by William Pole in 1898. Anti-Semitism was rife in Victorian England and Europe, with the Dreyfus Affair in nearby Paris. The Nazis used the play as propaganda against the Jewish people, while the performance at the Royal Shakespeare Company in 1932 by Komisarjevsky placed the impoverished Gobbo as the center of both derision and comedy, not Shylock, but Gobbo. The performances since World War II that we know of have, for the most part, been sympathetic toward Shylock. I do need to mention, though, that while I was doing my research, I found a 1950s director playbook from the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. I found written next to one of Shylock's lines, "He says it like a commie." So depending on where the play was performed, Shylock would be villain or hero. In criticism, apologies for Shylock and his goal to carve a pound of flesh from Antonio are abundant. Jewish Shakespeare scholar Janet Adelman mentions that while at university in the 1970s, she was told that she was worshiping at the wrong shrine. Given that setting, apologies for Shylock are understandable, certainly after the Holocaust. Seeing a person of your own culture humiliated on the stage tends to reopen the wound from past humiliation. Anti-Semitism needs to be fought on every level in our society. However, the singular connection of the Jews to anti-Semitism, as has been done continually in merchant performance and criticism, I argue, influences the Jewish people to identify with anti-Semitism, possibly more than with the theological frameworks and the moral foundation of the rabbis so intrinsic to the religion. This identification can be used by leaders to perpetuate persecution. As the German Jewish thinker Franz Rosenzweig rightly says, while history is intrinsic to Jewish culture, Jews who identify themselves only through history end up feeling more confused than fulfilled. He says that the content of Judaism is revelation towards redemption. The problem is that scholars try to fit Judaism into Shylock rather than fitting Shylock into Judaism. I'm going to read a section of my book now that explains what I mean by this. Scholars try to fit Judaism into the murder of Shylock. Murder and Jew then become dangerously and hurtfully synonymous in a Jewish criticism meant to defend the character of the Jew on the stage. This apology for Shylock oddly points to a simile used by Leonard Tennenhouse, who says that the attempt to immerse himself in the distant past and remove himself from the present is like wriggling out of a close-fitting shirt or a cultural skin. While this comment has sparked interesting discussions, I emphasize that in this effort of wriggling, the figurative shirt likely gets wrecked. The present must by nature become somewhat mangled while the critic is wriggling out of it. Likewise, Judaism must be somewhat mangled while the critic is wriggling it into the person of Shylock. While the comparison has its flaws, it does help to indicate that something in the perfectly Jewish Shylock motif is just not fitting right. If we allow the alignment of justice with possible murder, and once again, when you take a pound of anybody's flesh, murder is connected, in any setting or beginning at any level, we can face nightmarish consequences. If we want to mangle Judaism to fit it into Shylock, even where we are well-meaning, we cannot be surprised by the questionable actions and beliefs that a mangled Judaism might initiate. So then, if my analysis does not defend Shylock and revolve around anti-Semitism, how could my analysis possibly be Jewish? So then, what is Jewish besides anti-Semitism? How about revelation? By revelation, I mean, and this comes from Abraham Joshua Heschel, a continual community intimacy with God is experienced on Mount Sinai. Judaism, as says David Hartman, respected Jewish scholar, is not defined through Auschwitz, but through Sinai. In writing this, I first used the word glimpse. I wanted to show how Shakespeare's poetry propelled the characters towards a glimpse of consciousness, but would get cut off. And at that cutoff, characters would access a memory of the climax received to build upon it later. It was suggested that I use the word epiphany. This was my Ph.D. supervisor. He was Christian, I was Jewish, but I could see how the word epiphany could resonate in Jewish thought as well, especially considering the well-known quote by Abraham Joshua Heschel pointing to radical amazement. My book, therefore, uses Jewish theology rather than anti-Semitism as a way to illuminate the plot and the characters of The Merchant of Venice. Hannah Arendt says that a Jewish culture could be constructed post-Holocaust by including the great metaphysical post-biblical tradition. And yes, this is how I enter the conversation. I apply the suggestion of the academically accepted Hannah Arendt to Shakespeare analysis. I track each character to show how they move towards a metaphysical glimpse of consciousness. The past chief rabbi of Great Britain, Jonathan Sacks, says that we do not define ourselves as victims, but as free moral agents. A second. Uh-oh, I need help here. Okay, this one?
Yeah, try that.
Okay. No. I want to get the one on. Yeah, you got it. Thank you. Okay, thanks. When we define ourselves as victims, we engage in victimhood. Victimization is horrible. Victimhood is even more horrible because it strips potential from the victimized entity. The epiphanic analysis, in other words, seeing how characters actually get a glimpse of consciousness, okay, or move towards the otherworldly, in the play attempts to catapult the characters and the reader from victimhood to moral agency. Shakespeare's works allow Walter Benjamin's backward-staring angel of history to turn around and face what is here and to come, or a messianic vision, as described by the postmodern philosopher Jacques Derrida. An idea that intimacy with a higher being is possible because it is always almost happening, and therefore happening now. Let's see. Okay. Okay. Each chapter of my book tracks or follows 5 characters in their search for this otherworldly experience, or this epiphany. I track Shylock, Lorenzo, Jessica, Antonio, and Portia to find how they move towards consciousness. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about Shylock's epiphany, or almost epiphany. Nobody in the play really has some great realization, this huge, otherworldly experience, but I just want to track how they're almost getting there. Okay. So this is chapter 1. Shylock wants revelation. There are conflicts, though. Shylock is horribly degraded in the play, called the devil more than once. In Act 4, he is referred to by the Duke as the Jew, thereby throwing all Jews into one violent stereotype. He attaches himself to preconceived notions of the Christians, like tribal victimhood. He says, "Cursed be my tribe if I forgive him." At the same time, Shylock's expression of his religion is a bit skewed. He speaks of his Jewish gabardine, but not his prayer shawl, even though a prayer shawl has been introduced by many directors. He speaks of an ancient grudge rather than an ancient vow. He swears by Shabbat when a Jew honors Shabbat. His misunderstanding of his religion and the associated corruption points to a conflict in his reach for revelation. The corruption that Shakespeare is showing is both Jewish and Christian. It would not surprise me if Shakespeare received advice on how to create the perfectly hypocritical Jew to counter the perfectly hypocritical Christian character of Antonio. Shylock turns Judaism upside down, and this possibly results from the horrific persecution of his people. Shylock's confusions are Jewish and tolerable until he attempts to cross the boundary of murder. He has potential to achieve revelation from the start. He just does not know how to access it while stuck in the definition of himself as a victim. He says, "Sufferance is the badge of all my tribe." He means suffering. However, Shakespeare also uses the word suffirst in Henry V to point to piety. In that play, Hal speaks of the gods looking on his fallen soldiers. He says, "What kind of God art thou that suffers more of mortal griefs than do thy worshippers?" In this context, we could replace first with empathizes. What kind of God art thou that empathizes more of mortal griefs than do thy worshippers? It is the astounding ability of Shakespeare to be able to demonstrate transformation in one word. Shylock's line could come to mean, compassion is the badge of all my tribe. When Jessica, Shylock's daughter, runs off with the Christians, the covenantal paradigm breaks within Shylock. Shylock's "hath not a Jew eye" speech points to this break of covenant. The Jewish covenant is that God will watch over the Jews and protect them as long as they follow the laws, as referenced in the Torah of the Hebrew Bible. Shylock in that speech mentions bargains and nations, and not the scriptures or a higher power. Shylock, through materialistic artifices, is attempting to conjure his God. Rhythmically, the speech builds like Jewish liturgy. Here is a portion of it. Yeah. I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, organs, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons. If you prick us, do we not bleed? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? When the speech is finished, I claim we can see that his covenantal paradigm is utterly broken. All relations with God have stopped. Victimhood for Shylock becomes his authenticity and his spirituality. His cry for equality is devastating and emotional and seems to reflect a quintessential self and a true Judaism. But he takes on an identity in which a seemingly spiritual corruption, revenge, is embedded in a seemingly spiritual victimhood. Shylock, therefore, does not reach the essence of Judaism in his speech, but the moral antithesis. He says, "The villainy you teach me, I will execute. It shall go hard, but I will better the instruction." Joseph Caro, the respected 16th century rabbi, the Shulchan Aruch, claims that revenge, as much as we might want it, is only accepted in Jewish teachings if it is absolutely necessary for protection of the whole community. If the Jewish community supports Shylock, where are they when he is down? Tubal shows up, but he loans the money to Shylock, who loans the money to Antonio. Of course he's concerned, but who else does? Shylock's revenge is for Shylock alone. Shylock even says, "I stand for judgment. Shall I have it?" This seeking for revenge stops the seeking for revelation. This full stop becomes pronounced when he walks into the trial scene looking for the satisfaction of a bond that feels to Shylock very much like the satisfaction of a larger agreement, covenantal. Shylock is moving, he's charged and wound up because the covenant that seems to have crashed can be reinstated in his mind through his civil bond. During the trial, Shylock refuses to listen to Portia's calls for compassion, calls that are beautiful but also hypocritical themselves, because as soon as she realizes that mercy will not work, she turns to money to stop Shylock in his dangerous quest. Take mercy. Hey, he's not taking mercy. Where's the money? Will he accept the money? Finally, he is given the go-ahead to take his pound of flesh, and Portia says, "Why doth the Jew pause?" This is where I claim Shylock comes close to his epiphany. Why does Shylock pause? In my book, I claim that the sacrifice of Antonio is just too dirty to satisfy the revelation that Shylock so badly desires. However, at this moment, Shylock receives a glimpse of an epiphany beyond the sacrificial ritual itself butchered by Shylock and the harsh materialistic ethos of the present culture. He doesn't pull back so he can live. He pulls back from his quest because he cannot continue. But his agency does not go away. It moves beyond the trial scene and connects with the agencies of other characters as they too strive towards otherworldly satisfaction. Let's move on to Antonio, another chapter in my book. Antonio's epiphany happens when Shylock says, "Let the Christian go." Antonio, repressed and oppressed by the seeming conflict between his God and his homoerotic tendencies, wants to be symbolically crucified during the trial scene. He wants his beloved Bassanio to see his, Antonio's, synthesized dedication to both godly and erotic love. He wants to die for Bassanio. He says, "Pray God, Bassanio come to see me pay his debt, and then I care not." Yet he is not killed. His expected death is cut off by the shock of life. But at that moment, he comes close to an epiphany, proven by his long silence, an epiphany that, like that of Shylock, moves beyond the trial scene with an ongoing agency to seek satisfaction. Let's move on to Portia. Portia relates her transcendence to her own goddess centrality. I'm going to read a little piece in my book about Portia. The dead, unknown suitors, unknown relationships, a subjugating patriarchy, too much money, her gnawing virginity, and a vastly impossible supernal abstraction, which draws men to it instead of to her, accentuate her stigmatization and dislodgement from her setting. Portia's vexation at her peripheral status is vital to this analysis. She wins the trial, but realizes that such a win cannot cement her goddess self. This is because Bassanio, not knowing that she, in the mask of the lawyer, is his wife, offers the ring to her. She says, "This cannot be." At that moment, her epiphany begins to occur. She's starting to realize that being a goddess and central to the setting does not safeguard love. Lorenzo desperately wants an epiphany and at the same time loves Jessica. He says, "Wise, fair, and true shall she be placed in my constant soul." He shows his love by braving the rules of his own culture and courting a Jewish woman. I'm going to read a little bit about Lorenzo here. Actually, okay, he subjugates Jessica and is influenced by the corruption of his community. However, in my book, I compare him to John Rolfe, the American settler who subjugated Pocahontas so completely, who eventually caused the death of Pocahontas. Lorenzo does not kill anyone. He comes close to his epiphany during his speech to Jessica in Act 5, when he yearns so badly to hear the cherubim. He says, "Sit, Jessica, look how the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patterns of bright gold. There is not the smallest orb which thou beholdst, but in his motion like an angel sings, still choiring to the young-eyed cherubims. Such harmony is in immortal souls, but whilst this muddy vesture of decay doth grossly close it in, we cannot hear it." The agency with which he describes an epiphany demonstrates drive and proximity, but he's held back by his muddy vesture of decay. What a great piece of poetry. Or the same subjugation and corruption that's so present in his community. But his agency still continues. Jessica has her epiphany during her long silence in Act 5 after Lorenzo's speech. She yearns for the epiphany, and at first what holds her back is her father's victimhood, then her lover's strange mixture of love and prejudice, obviously the patriarchal religion, and corrupt society. She becomes unplugged from her father's victimhood when she runs off with Lorenzo, and flattened by Lorenzo's claim to a muddy vesture of decay, which I argue she does not share, even though he says we. She realizes that the greater their hearing of the supernal, the greater their loving synthesis. She yearns to hear the cherubim with Lorenzo, who she loves. Her comment, "I am never merry when I hear sweet music," and her following silence shows her agency to hear the cherubim instead of the popular music amid the cultural decay of the time. A focus on Jessica's epiphany offers readers a distinctive and significant spiritual possibility in a play that is usually read in reductively materialistic terms. Finally, what Shakespeare is saying is that the dissatisfaction of the characters during the trial scene causes their drive to continue and to be cemented in the symbol of the rings. The character's yearning and desire in my analysis breaks through religious tropes and keeps reaching for that ultimate satisfaction. Finally, Shakespeare shows how the epiphanies of all the characters are cemented in the figure of the rings. Portia and Bassanio repeat the word ring many times in Act 5. Read that. Bassanio says, "Sweet Portia, if you did know to whom I gave the ring, if you did know for whom I gave the ring, and would conceive for what I gave the ring, and how unwillingly I left the ring, when naught would be accepted but the ring, you would abate the strength of your displeasure, Portia. If you had known the virtue of the ring, or half her worthiness that gave the ring, or your own honor to contain the ring, you would not then have parted with the ring." The rings make phenomenal real. I want to read a piece in the conclusion of my book that explains how the rings relate to the epiphanies of the characters. The rings. The dialogue poetically illuminates the circularity of the ring itself. The ring is cycling out of ancient religious paradigms towards a covenant no longer limited by religion. The repetition of the rings 10 times in these speeches of Act 5 has a strange effect. We hear ring, 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 ring. The noun ring, that is also a verb to ring, points to the verb in the repetition of its sound. The ring can be said to not only be ringing, but ringing obsessively. The ring is made of gold. Metals are used for tools to fix things or break them. Let's see here. Yay. To fix things or break them, to connect as serves a joint or a screw. The rings are tangible and real. The connection of ring to ring is like the soldering of love to love. The rings cement love even while we face their fluctuating symbolism. They expand time in that they become a repeated event in the text. The rings, by expanding time, are not stopped still. They move and perhaps transform. The rings are solid. The rings cement transformation and transcendence, but in the present, past, and future, as the audience watches now. The ring repeatedly rings now. It rings so long, hard, and consistently that love can enter the audience cognitively, like a wake-up call. The ringing proclaims the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. The ring symbolizes the character's ability to actively transform a paradigm of violence and anti-Semitism. The intense drive from the child goes into the rings, through the rings, and potentially to the hearts of the characters in the audience. The rings point to a religion beyond religion, and to a day when the rings will no longer be needed. The rings' physicality show that a physical thing can be an epiphany. The human, all humans, also physical, can possibly embody a similar and unified ring-like epiphany. By the end of Merchant, the ring is already growing beyond itself. Portia indicates the universal expansion of the ring in the image of the cycles of the sun. Portia turns her agency from the trial to the rings, and then to mourning. It is as if the ring is object once described as gone, is transforming once again. Portia says, "It is almost morning, and yet I am sure you are not satisfied." The rings just may indicate a cycle of repair and growth for a future human community. While Portia points out the cycle of the sun and its blaze of light, Lorenzo and Jessica, with their intense love, can possibly take us to it. Even in a world of dissatisfaction, violence, and corruption, the merchant character can access the epiphany, a natural and peaceful cycle of existence. Ultimately, this cycle is the foundation of a new social political paradigm of earth, healing, and peace. Antonio's satisfaction is not complete. Perhaps he still does not know why he's so sad. This satisfaction might not be here yet, but we get the feeling that it might still be here now. Thank you.